On Palestine. Book by Noam Chomsky, Ilan Pappé and Frank Barat. Chapter 7, Gaza's Torment, Israel's Crimes, Our Responsibilities. Chapter 8, A Brief History of Israel's Incremental Genocide. Chapter 9, Nightmare in Gaza. Chapter 10, The Futility and Immorality of Partition in Palestine. Chapter 11, Ceasefires in which violations never cease. Chapter 12, An Address to the United Nations. Part 2 Reflections. Chapter 7. Gaza's Torment, Israel's Crimes, Our Responsibilities. Noam Chomsky. At 3 a.m. Gaza time, July 9, 2014, in the midst of Israel's latest exercise in savagery, I received a phone call from a young Palestinian journalist in Gaza. In the background, I could hear his infant child wailing, amid the sounds of explosions and jet planes, targeting any civilian who moves, and homes as well. He just saw a friend of his in a car clearly marked "Press, get blown away." And he heard shrieks next door after an explosion but couldn't go outside or he'd be a likely target. This is a quiet neighborhood, no military targets, except Palestinians who are fair game for Israel's high-tech US-supplied military machine. He said that 70% of the ambulances have been destroyed, and that by then more than 70 had been killed, and of the 300 or so wounded, about two-thirds were women and children. Few Hamas activists or rocket launching sites have been hit, just the usual victims. It is important to understand what life is like in Gaza when Israel's behavior is irrestrained, in between the regular manufactured crises like this one. A good sense is given in a report to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, by Mads Gilbert, the courageous and expert Norwegian physician who has worked extensively in Gaza, including throughout the vicious and murderous Cast Lead operation. In every respect, the situation is disastrous. Just keeping to children, Gilbert reports, Palestinian children in Gaza are suffering immensely. A large proportion are affected by the man-made malnourishment regime caused by the Israeli imposed blockage. Prevalence of anemia in children under 2 years in Gaza is at 72.8%, while prevalence of wasting, stunting, underweight have been documented at 34.3%, 31.4%, 31.45% respectively. And it gets worse as the report proceeds. When Israel is on good behavior, more than 2 Palestinian children are killed every week, a pattern that goes back over 14 years. The underlying cause is the criminal occupation and the programs to reduce Palestinian life to bare survival in Gaza, while Palestinians are restricted to unviable cantons in the West Bank and Israel takes over what it wants, all in gross violation of international law and explicit Security Council resolutions, not to speak of minimal decency. And it will continue as long as it is supported by Washington and tolerated by Europe, to our everlasting shame. Originally published in Z Magazine, July 12, 2014. Chapter 8. A Brief History of Israel's Incremental Genocide. Ilan Pappé. In a September 2006 article for the Electronic Intifada, I defined the Israeli policy toward the Gaza Strip as an incremental genocide. Israel's present assault on Gaza, alas, indicates that this policy continues unabated. The term is important since it appropriately locates Israel's barbaric action, then and now, within a wider historical context. People in Gaza and elsewhere in Palestine feel disappointed at the lack of any significant international reaction to the carnage and destruction the Israeli assault has so far left behind in the Strip. The inability, or unwillingness, to act seems to be first and foremost an acceptance of the Israeli narrative and argumentation for the crisis in Gaza. Israel has developed a very clear narrative about the present carnage in Gaza. It is a tragedy caused by an unprovoked Hamas missile attack on the Jewish state, to which Israel had to react in self-defense. While mainstream Western media, academia, and politicians may have reservations about the proportionality of the force used by Israel, they accept the gist of this argument. This Israeli narrative is totally rejected in the world of cyberactivism and alternative media. There it seems the condemnation of the Israeli action as a war crime is widespread and consensual. The main difference between the two analyses, from above and from below, is the willingness of activists to study deeper and in a more profound way the ideological and historical context of the present Israeli action in Gaza. A historical evaluation and contextualization of the present Israeli assault on Gaza and that of the previous three since 2006 expose clearly the Israeli genocidal policy there. An incremental policy of massive killing that is less a product of a callous intention and more the inevitable outcome of Israel's overall strategy toward Palestine in general and the areas it occupied in 1967 in particular. This context should be insisted upon, since the Israeli propaganda machine attempts again and again to narrate its policies as out of context, and turns the pretext it found for every previous wave of destruction into the main justification for another spree of indiscriminate slaughter in the killing fields of Palestine. The Zionist strategy of branding its brutal policies as an ad hoc response to this or that Palestinian action is as old as the Zionist presence in Palestine itself. It was used repeatedly as a justification for implementing the Zionist vision of a future Palestine that has in it very few, if any, native Palestinians. The means for achieving this goal has changed over the years, but the formula has remained the same. Whatever the Zionist vision of a Jewish state might be, it can only materialize without any significant number of Palestinians in it. And nowadays the vision is of an Israel stretching over almost the whole of historic Palestine, where millions of Palestinians still live. The present genocidal wave has, like all the previous ones, also a more immediate background. It has been born out of an attempt to foil the Palestinian decision to form a unity government that even the United States could not object to. The collapse of U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry's desperate peace initiative legitimized the Palestinian appeal to international organizations to stop the occupation. At the same time, Palestinians gained wide international blessing for the cautious attempt represented by the unity government to strategize once again a coordinated policy among the various Palestinian groups and agendas. Ever since June 1967, Israel has searched for a way to keep the territories it occupied that year without incorporating their indigenous Palestinian population into its rights-bearing citizenry. All the while it participated in a peace process, charade to cover up or buy time for its unilateral colonization policies on the ground. In the last few decades, Israel differentiated between areas it wished to control directly and those it would manage indirectly, with the aim in the long run of downsizing the Palestinian population to a minimum through, among other means, ethnic cleansing and economic and geographic strangulation. Thus the West Bank was in effect divided into a Jewish and a Palestinian zones, a reality most Israelis can live with provided the Palestinian Bantustan's inhabitants are content with their incarceration within these megaprisons. The geopolitical location of the West Bank creates the impression in Israel, at least, that it is possible to achieve this without anticipating a third uprising or too much international condemnation. The Gaza Strip, due to its unique geopolitical location, did not lend itself that easily to such a strategy. Ever since 1994, and even more so when Ariel Sharon came to power as Prime Minister in the early 2000s, the strategy there has been to ghettoize Gaza and somehow hope that the people there, 1.8 million as of today, would be dropped into eternal oblivion. But the ghetto proved to be rebellious and unwilling to live under conditions of strangulation, isolation, starvation, and economic collapse. There was no way it would be annexed to Egypt, either in 1948 or in 2014. In 1948, Israel pushed into the Gaza area, before it became a strip. Hundreds of thousands of refugees it expelled from the northern Nakab and southern coast who, so Israel hoped, would move even farther away from Palestine. For a while after 1967, Israel wanted to keep the West Bank as a township which provided unskilled labor but without any human and civil rights. When the occupied people resisted the continued oppression in 2 intifadas, the West Bank was bisected into small Bantustans encircled by Jewish colonies, but it did not work in the too small and too dense Gaza Strip. The Israelis were unable to West Bank the Strip, so to speak. So they cordoned it as a ghetto, and when it resisted, the army was allowed to use its most formidable and lethal weapons to crush it. The inevitable result of an accumulative reaction of this kind was genocidal. On May 15, Israeli forces killed 2 Palestinian youths in the West Bank town of Baitunia, their cold-blooded slayings by a sniper's bullet captured on video. Their names, Nadim Nawara and Mohammed Abu al-Thahir, were added to a long list of such killings in recent months and years. The killing of 3 Israeli teenagers, 2 of them minors, abducted in the occupied West Bank in June, was perhaps in reprisal for killings of Palestinian children. But for all the depredations of the oppressive occupation, it provided the pretext first and foremost for destroying the delicate unity in the West Bank, a unity that followed a decision by the Palestinian Authority to forsake the peace process, and appeal to international organizations to judge Israel according to a human and civil rights yardstick. Both developments were viewed as alarming in Israel. The abductions also created the pretext for the implementation of the old dream of wiping out Hamas from Gaza so that the ghetto could be quiet again. Since 1994, even before the rise of Hamas to power in the Gaza Strip, the very particular geopolitical location of the Strip has made it clear that any collective punitive action, such as the one inflicted now, could only be an operation of massive killings and destruction, in other words, of a continued genocide. This recognition never inhibited the generals who give the orders to bomb the people from the air, the sea, and the ground. Downsizing the number of Palestinians all over historic Palestine is still the Zionist vision. In Gaza, its implementation takes its most inhuman form. The particular timing of this genocidal wave is determined, as in the past, by additional considerations. The domestic social unrest of 2011 is still simmering, and for a while there was a public demand to cut military expenditures and move money from the inflated defense budget to social services. The army branded this possibility as suicidal. There is nothing like a military operation to stifle any voices calling on the government to cut its military expenses. Typical hallmarks of the previous stages in this incremental genocide reappear in this wave as well. One can witness again consensual Israeli Jewish support for the massacre of civilians in the Gaza Strip without one significant voice of dissent. In Tel Aviv, the few who dared to demonstrate against it were beaten by Jewish hooligans, while the police stood by and watched. Academia, as always, becomes part of the machinery. The prestigious private university, the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya, has established a civilian headquarters, where students volunteer to serve as mouthpieces in the propaganda campaign abroad. Various universities have offered the state their student bodies to help and battle for the Israeli narrative in cyberspace, and the alternative media. The Israeli media, as well, has towed loyally the government's line, showing no pictures of the human catastrophe Israel has wreaked and informing its public that this time, the world understands us and is behind us. That statement is valid to a point as the political elites in the West continue to provide the old immunity to the Jewish state. The recent appeal by Western governments to the prosecutor in the International Court of Justice in The Hague not to look into Israel's crimes in Gaza is a case in point. Wide sections of the Western media have followed suit and have justified by and large Israel's actions, including the French media, especially France 24, and the BBC, which continue to shamefully parrot Israeli propaganda. This is not surprising, since pro-Israel lobby groups continue to work tirelessly to press Israel's case in France and the rest of Europe, as they do in the United States. This distorted coverage is also fed by a sense among Western journalists that what happens in Gaza pales in comparison to the atrocities in Iraq and Syria. Comparisons like this are usually provided without a wider historical perspective. A longer view on the history of the Palestinians would be a much more appropriate way to evaluate their suffering vis-a-vis the carnage elsewhere. But not only a historical view is needed for a better understanding of the massacre in Gaza. A dialectical approach that identifies the connection between Israel's immunity and the horrific developments elsewhere is required as well. The dehumanization in Iraq and Syria is widespread and terrifying, as it is in Gaza. But there is one crucial difference between these cases and the Israeli brutality. The former are condemned as barbarous and inhuman worldwide, while those committed by Israel are still publicly licensed and approved by the President of the United States, the leaders of the European Union, and Israel's other friends in the world. Whether it is burning alive a Palestinian youth from Jerusalem, fatally shooting 2 others just for the fun of it in Bitunia, or slaying whole families in Gaza, these are all acts that can only be perpetrated if the victim is dehumanized. The only chance for a successful struggle against Zionism in Palestine is the one based on a human and civil rights agenda that does not differentiate between one violation and the other and yet identifies clearly the victim and the victimizers. Those who commit atrocities in the Arab world against oppressed minorities and helpless communities, as well as the Israelis who commit these crimes against the Palestinian people, should all be judged by the same moral and ethical standards. They are all war criminals, though in the case of Palestine they have been at work longer than anyone else. It does not really matter what the religious identity is of the people who commit the atrocities or in the name of which religion they purport to speak. Whether they call themselves jihadists, Judaists, or Zionists, they should be treated in the same way. A world that would stop employing double standards in its dealings with Israel is a world that could be far more effective in its response to war crimes elsewhere in the world. The cessation of the incremental genocide in Gaza and the restitution of the basic human and civil rights of Palestinians wherever they are, including the right of return, is the only way to open a new vista for a productive international intervention in the Middle East as a whole. Adapted from Israel's Incremental Genocide in the Gaza Ghetto. Electronic Intifada, July 13, 2014, and The Historical Perspective of the 2014 Gaza Massacre, Information Clearing House, August 23, 2014. Chapter 9. Nightmare in Gaza. Noam Chomsky. Amid all the horrors unfolding in the latest Israeli offensive in Gaza, Israel's goal is simple: quiet for quiet, a return to the norm. For the West Bank, the norm is that Israel continues its illegal construction of settlements and infrastructure so that it can integrate into Israel whatever might be of value, meanwhile consigning Palestinians to unviable cantons and subjecting them to repression and violence. For Gaza, the norm is a miserable existence under a cruel and destructive siege that Israel administers to permit bare survival, but nothing more. For the past 14 years, the norm is that Israel kills more than 2 Palestinian children a week. The latest Israeli rampage was set off by the brutal murder of 3 Israeli boys from a settler community in the occupied West Bank. A month before, 2 Palestinian boys were shot dead in the West Bank city of Ramallah. That elicited little attention, which is understandable, since it is routine. The institutionalized disregard for Palestinian life in the West helps explain not only why Palestinians resort to violence, Middle East analyst Muin Rabbani reports, but also Israel's latest assault on the Gaza Strip. Quiet for quiet also enables Israel to carry forward its program of separating Gaza from the West Bank. That program has been pursued vigorously, always with U.S. support, ever since the U.S. and Israel accepted the Oslo Accords, which declare the 2 regions to be an inseparable territorial unity. A look at the map explains the rationale. Gaza provides Palestine's only access to the outside world, so once the 2 are separated, any autonomy that Israel might grant to Palestinians in the West Bank would leave them effectively imprisoned between hostile states, Israel and Jordan. The imprisonment will become even more severe as Israel continues its program of expelling Palestinians from the Jordan Valley and constructing Israeli settlements there. The norm in Gaza was described in detail by the heroic Norwegian trauma surgeon Mads Gilbert, who has worked in Gaza's main hospital through Israel's most grotesque crimes and returned again for the current onslaught. In June 2014 he submitted a report on the Gaza health sector to the UNRWA, the UN agency that tries desperately, on a shoestring, to care for refugees. At least 57% of Gaza households are food insecure and about 80% are now aid recipients, Gilbert reports. Food insecurity and rising poverty also mean that most residents cannot meet their daily caloric requirements, while over 90% of the water in Gaza has been deemed unfit for human consumption, a situation that is becoming even worse as Israel again attacks water and sewage systems, leaving 1.2 million people with even more severe disruption of the barest necessity of life. In an interview, human rights lawyer Raji Sawarani, who has remained in Gaza through years of Israeli brutality and terror, said, "The most common sentence I heard when people began to talk about ceasefire, everybody says it's better for all of us to die and not go back to the situation we used to have before this war. We don't want that again. We have no dignity, no pride, we are just soft targets, and we are very cheap. Either this situation really improves or it is better to just die." I am talking about intellectuals, academics, ordinary people, everybody is saying that. Similar sentiments have been widely heard. It is better to die with dignity than to be slowly strangled by the torturer. For Gaza, the plans for the norm were explained forthrightly by Dov Weissglass, the confidant of Ariel Sharon who negotiated the withdrawal of Israeli settlers from Gaza in 2005. Hailed as a grand gesture in Israel and among acolytes and the deluded elsewhere, the withdrawal was in reality a carefully staged, national trauma, properly ridiculed by informed Israeli commentators, among them Israel's leading sociologist, the late Baruch Kimmerling. What actually happened is that Israeli hawks, led by Sharon, realized that it made good sense to transfer the illegal settlers from their subsidized communities in devastated Gaza to subsidized settlements in the other occupied territories, which Israel intends to keep. But instead of simply transferring them, as would have been simple enough, it was considered more effective to present the world with images of little children pleading with soldiers not to destroy their homes, amid cries of "never again," with the implication obvious. What made the farce even more transparent was that it was a replica of the staged trauma, when Israel had to evacuate the Egyptian Sinai in 1982. But it played very well for the intended audience abroad. In Weissglass's own description of the transfer of settlers from Gaza to other occupied territories, what I effectively agreed to with the Americans was that the major settlement blocks in the West Bank would not be dealt with at all, and the rest will not be dealt with until the Palestinians turn into Finns, but a special kind of Finns, who would accept rule by a foreign power. The significance is the freezing of the political process. Weissglass continued. And when you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state and you prevent a discussion about the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Effectively, this whole package that is called the Palestinian state, with all that it entails, has been removed from our agenda indefinitely. And all this with George W. Bush's authority and permission and the ratification of both houses of Congress. Weissglass added that Gazans would remain on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger, which would not help Israel's fading reputation. With their vaunted technical efficiency, Israeli experts determined exactly how many calories a day Gazans needed for bare survival, while also depriving them of medicines, construction materials, or other means of decent life. Israeli military forces confined them by land, sea, and air to what British Prime Minister David Cameron accurately described as a prison camp. The Israeli withdrawal left Israel in total control of Gaza, hence the occupying power under international law. The official story is that after Israel graciously handed Gaza over to the Palestinians, in the hope that they would construct a flourishing state, they revealed their true nature by subjecting Israel to unremitting rocket attack and forcing the captive population to become martyrs, leaving Israel in a bad light for failing to anticipate this scenario. Reality is rather different. In January 2006, Palestinians committed a major crime. They voted the wrong way in a carefully monitored free election, handing control of parliament to Hamas. The media constantly intone that Hamas is dedicated to the destruction of Israel. In reality, Hamas leaders have repeatedly made it clear that Hamas would accept a two-state settlement in accord with the international consensus that has been blocked by the United States and Israel for 40 years. In contrast, Israel is dedicated to the destruction of Palestine, apart from some occasional meaningless words, and is implementing that commitment. True, Israel accepted the roadmap for reaching a two-state settlement initiated by President George W. Bush and adopted by the quartet that is to supervise it, the United States, the European Union, the United Nations, and Russia. But as he accepted the roadmap, Prime Minister Sharon at once added 14 reservations that effectively nullify it. The facts were known to activists, but revealed to the general public for the first time in Jimmy Carter's book Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. They remain under wraps in media reporting and commentary. The unrevised 1999 platform of Israel's governing party, Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud, flatly rejects the establishment of a Palestinian Arab state west of the Jordan River. And for those who like to obsess about meaningless charters, the core component of Likud, Menachem Begin's Haret, has yet to abandon its founding doctrine that the territory on both sides of the Jordan is part of the land of Israel. The crime of the Palestinians in January 2006 was punished at once. The United States and Israel, with Europe shamefully trailing behind, imposed harsh sanctions on the errant population, and Israel stepped up its violence. The United States and Israel quickly initiated plans for a military coup to overthrow the elected government. When Hamas had the effrontery to foil the plans, the Israeli assaults and the siege became far more severe. There should be no need to review again the dismal record since. The relentless siege and savage attacks are punctuated by episodes of mowing the lawn, to borrow Israel's cheery expression for its periodic exercises in shooting fish in a pond as part of what it calls a war of defense. Once the lawn is mowed and the desperate population seeks to rebuild somehow from the devastation and the murders, there is a ceasefire agreement. The most recent ceasefire was established after Israel's October 2012 assault, called Operation Pillar of Defense. Though Israel maintained its siege, Hamas observed the ceasefire, as Israel concedes. Matters changed in April of this year when Fatah and Hamas forged a unity agreement that established a new government of technocrats unaffiliated with either party. Israel was naturally furious, all the more so when even the Obama administration joined the West in signaling approval. The unity agreement not only undercuts Israel's claim that it cannot negotiate with a divided Palestine, but also threatens the long-term goal of dividing Gaza from the West Bank and pursuing its destructive policies in both regions. Something had to be done, and an occasion arose on June 12, when the 3 Israeli boys were murdered in the West Bank. Early on, the Netanyahu government knew that they were dead, but pretended otherwise, which provided the opportunity to launch a rampage in the West Bank, targeting Hamas. Prime Minister Netanyahu claimed to have certain knowledge that Hamas was responsible. That too was a lie. One of Israel's leading authorities on Hamas, Shlomi Eldar, reported almost at once that the killers very likely came from a dissident clan in Hebron that has long been a thorn in the side of Hamas. Eldar added, "I'm sure they didn't get any green light from the leadership of Hamas, they just thought it was the right time to act." The 18-day rampage after the kidnapping, however, succeeded in undermining the feared unity government, and sharply increasing Israeli repression. According to Israeli military sources, Israeli soldiers arrested 419 Palestinians, including 335 affiliated with Hamas, and killed 6 Palestinians, also searching thousands of locations and confiscating $350,000. Israel also conducted dozens of attacks in Gaza, killing 5 Hamas members on July 7. Hamas finally reacted with its first rockets in 19 months, providing Israel with the pretext for Operation Protective Edge on July 8. By July 31, around 1,400 Palestinians had been killed, mostly civilians, including hundreds of women and children, and 3 Israeli civilians. By then, large areas of Gaza had been turned into rubble. During brief bombing pauses, relatives desperately sought shattered bodies or household items in the ruins of homes. For hospitals had been attacked, each yet another war crime. The main power plant was attacked, sharply curtailing the already very limited electricity and, worse still, reducing still further the minimal availability of fresh water. Another war crime. Meanwhile, rescue teams and ambulances are repeatedly attacked. The atrocities mount throughout Gaza, while Israel claims that its goal is to destroy tunnels at the border. Israeli officials laud the humanity of what it calls the most moral army in the world, which informs residents that their homes will be bombed. The practice is sadism, sanctimoniously disguising itself as mercy, in the words of Israeli journalist Amira Hass. A recorded message demanding hundreds of thousands of people leave their already targeted homes, for another place, equally dangerous, 10 kilometers away. In fact, there is no place in the prison of Gaza safe from Israeli sadism, which may even exceed the terrible crimes of Operation Cast Lead in 2008 to 2009. The hideous revelations elicited the usual reaction from the most moral president in the world, Barack Obama: great sympathy for Israelis, bitter condemnation of Hamas, and calls for moderation on both sides. When the current episode of sadism is called off, Israel hopes to be free to pursue its criminal policies in the occupied territories without interference, and with the U.S. support it has enjoyed in the past, military, economic, and diplomatic, and also ideological, by framing the issues in conformity to Israeli doctrines. Gazans will be free to return to the norm in their Israeli-run prison, while in the West Bank Palestinians can watch in peace as Israel dismantles what remains of their possessions. That is the likely outcome if the United States maintains its decisive and virtually unilateral support for Israeli crimes, and its rejection of the long-standing international consensus on diplomatic settlement. But the future will be quite different if the United States withdraws that support. In that case, it would be possible to move toward the enduring solution in Gaza that U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry called for, eliciting hysterical condemnation in Israel because the phrase could be interpreted as calling for an end to Israel's siege and regular attacks. And, horror of horrors, the phrase might even be interpreted as calling for implementation of international law in the rest of the occupied territories. It is not that Israel's security would be threatened by adherence to international law, it would very likely be enhanced. But as explained 40 years ago by Israeli General Ezer Weizman, later president, Israel could then not exist according to the scale, spirit, and quality she now embodies. There are similar cases in recent history. Indonesian generals swore that they would never abandon what Australian Foreign Minister Gareth Evans called the Indonesian province of East Timor, as he was making a deal to steal Timorese oil. And as long as they retained U.S. support through decades of virtually genocidal slaughter, their goals were realistic. In September 1999, under considerable domestic and international pressure, President Clinton finally informed them quietly that the game was over and they instantly withdrew, while Evans turned to his new career as the lauded apostle of responsibility to protect, to be sure, in a version designed to permit Western resort to violence at will. Another relevant case is South Africa. In 1958, South Africa's foreign minister informed the U.S. ambassador that although his country was becoming a pariah state, it would not matter as long as the U.S. support continued. His assessment proved fairly accurate. 30 years later, Reagan was the last significant holdout in supporting the apartheid regime. Within a few years, Washington joined the world, and the regime collapsed, not for that reason alone, of course. One crucial factor was the remarkable Cuban role in the liberation of Africa, generally ignored in the West though not in Africa. 40 years ago Israel made the fateful decision to choose expansion over security, rejecting a full peace treaty offered by Egypt in return for evacuation from the occupied Egyptian Sinai, where Israel was initiating extensive settlement and development projects. It has adhered to that policy ever since, making essentially the same judgment as South Africa did in 1958. In the case of Israel, if the United States decided to join the world, the impact would be far greater. Relations of power allow nothing else, as has been demonstrated over and over when Washington has demanded that Israel abandon cherished goals. Furthermore, Israel by now has little recourse, after having adopted policies that turned it from a country that was greatly admired to one that is feared and despised. Policies it is pursuing with blind determination today in its resolute march toward moral deterioration and possible ultimate destruction. Could U.S. policy change? It's not impossible. Public opinion has shifted considerably in recent years, particularly among the young, and it cannot be completely ignored. For some years there has been a good basis for public demands that Washington observe its own laws and cut off military aid to Israel. U.S. law requires that no security assistance may be provided to any country the government of which engages in a consistent pattern of gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. Israel most certainly is guilty of this consistent pattern, and has been for many years. Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, author of this provision of the law, has brought up its potential applicability to Israel in specific cases, and with a well-conducted educational, organizational, and activist effort such initiatives could be pursued successfully. That could have a very significant impact in itself, while also providing a springboard for further actions to compel Washington to become part of the international community, and to observe international law and norms. Nothing could be more significant for the tragic Palestinian victims of many years of violence and repression. Adapted from Nightmare in Gaza, Alternet, August 1, 2014, and Outrage, Information Clearinghouse, August 3, 2014. Chapter 10. The Futility and Immorality of Partition in Palestine. Ilan Pappé. There is a famous Jewish maxim that one should look for one's lost key where it was lost and not where there is light. In many ways, the so-called peace process in Palestine, with the concept of the two-state solution as its benchmark, has been a futile search under a powerful street lamp far away from the lost key. The congregation of world leaders, mediators, liberal Zionists, so-called moderate Palestinians, and some of Palestine's best friends in the West under the street lamp was motivated by a shared misconception of the Palestine conflict, as one fought between two national movements. From within this perspective two other misconceptions emerge. The conflict in Palestine started more or less in 1967 with the occupation by Israel of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and secondly, these two areas are more Palestinian in nature and history than the rest of Palestine. Away from the lamplight truths which are uncomfortable it seems not only to Zionists but also to those who fear a direct confrontation with the Jewish state. There in the darkness one can find the only relevant framing of the conflict in Palestine, as a struggle between a settler colonialist movement and a native indigenous population that has raged since the late 19th century, until today. Seen from the perspective of settler colonialism, the conflict is a relentless and tireless engagement, with the attempt to take over as much of Palestine as possible and leave in it as few Palestinians as possible. Ironically, The wish to de-Arabaize the country stemmed from a Zionist aspiration to create a European kind of democracy within the midst of the Arab world, with one caveat only: it had to be a Jewish democracy. Hence the colonialist impulse of the settlers was always geographical and demographic. The movement in its early stages was led by pragmatic leaders, such as David Ben-Gurion, who recognized the need to take over Palestine bit by bit, and without forgetting the imperative of always having an exclusive Jewish majority in the land. And therefore, when the Jews were less than a third of the population during the Mandatory Period, 1918 to 1948, the movement proposed a partition of Palestine in a way that would ensure the small minority of settlers' demographic exclusivity in parts of Palestine, with the hope of absorbing more settlers in the future and thus more land. In fact, early on, in the 1930s, the Zionist leaders tried to persuade the British government to help materialize these dreams by transferring Palestinians from future Jewish areas as part of a solution to the emerging conflict, but the empire was not convinced. So the Zionist movement had to do it itself, namely had to contemplate both the takeover of the space for a future Jewish democracy, and the removal of the Palestinians living in that space. The need to use force in order to change the demographic balance in a country in which the Jewish settlers were still only one-third in 1948 was accentuated by the failure of the Zionist movement to purchase a significant number of lands. The inevitable result was a vast ethnic cleansing operation in Palestine that had begun even before the British left the country in February 1948 and ended in early 1949. This ethnic cleansing operation created the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, two geopolitical entities that came to the world as part of the incremental takeover of Palestine by the Zionist movement, as did a third area, Wadi Era, which was part of the West Bank but was annexed to Israel under duress, when Jordan was threatened with war and conceded this slice of the West Bank to Israel in April 1949, as part of the bilateral armistice agreement. The West Bank was carved out of the parts of Palestine allocated to an Arab state in the UN Partition Resolution of November 29, 1947. It was the quid pro quo for a Jordanian consent to take only a limited part in the overall Arab attempt to salvage Palestine. The Jordanian Legion and the nascent Israeli army fought a bitter battle over Jerusalem and divided it between the two sides. The Gaza Strip was carved out of the Nakab or Negev and was created by Israel as a huge receptor of refugees. Israeli forces systematically cleansed all the villages and inhabitants south of Jaffa and pushed them into what became the Gaza Strip. So these two geopolitical units were the leftovers of the Zionist attempt to Judaize the whole of Palestine. One was created as a result of a strategic understanding with Jordan, the other for the purpose of solving the demographic issue. This was the real partition of Palestine until 1967. The fictive peace partition, the street lamp, was conceived by Israel after the 1967 war. It came within a set of strategic decisions taken by the 13th government of Israel. The background for these decisions was a discontent among many of Israel's chief policymakers about the 1948 tacit alliance with Jordan. There was an active lobby pushing Prime Minister Ben-Gurion, who was in power until 1963, to reconsider this alliance and find a pretext to occupy either parts of the West Bank or the whole of it. These were powerful people. Some of them were generals in the 1948 war, such as Yigal Allon and Moshe Dayan. Others were ideologues who considered the West Bank as the heart of ancient Israel, without which the Jewish state could not survive. The military men also concocted the myth of the River Jordan as a natural barrier for future invasions from the east against the Jewish state. Anyone who had seen the River Jordan, even on a particular good day, would know that this creek could hardly stop a unit of donkeys, let alone tanks. This lobby had its chance to transform expansionist dreams into strategic planning once Ben-Gurion left office, in 1963. Ben-Gurion was adamant in his objection for occupying any more parts of Palestine, since he dreaded the incorporation of an additional and large number of Palestinians. But once he was gone, the government intensified its preparations for the eventuality of such an expansion. While Ben-Gurion was in charge, he prevented a dangerous circumstance from developing into a war, circumstances quite similar to the ones which led to the 1967 war. In 1960, Gamal Abdul Nasser, the leader of Egypt and the Arab world, embarked on a brinkmanship policy that foreshadowed his moves in 1967. A different Israeli Prime Minister and a different UN Secretary General did not prevent a war that their predecessors successfully diffused in 1960. From 1963 onward, Israeli strategists intensified their preparations for the eventuality of a future occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. These preparations included very systematic planning for how to run the two areas as occupied military zones. They were put into effective use within a few days in June 1967. But they were not enough. A strategy had to be formulated, and this task was taken up by the Israeli government in several meetings during the following months after the fighting subsided. Immediately after the 1967 war ended, the 13th Government of Israel began discussions that produced a series of decisions that all in one way or another condemned all the people who lived in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to life imprisonment in the biggest ever human megaprison witnessed in modern times. The Palestinians living there were incarcerated in such a fashion for crimes they never committed and for offenses that were never ever pronounced, admitted, or defined. Today a third generation of such inmates have begun their life in that megaprison. The particular government which took this callous and inhuman decision represented the widest possible Zionist consensus. Every ideological stream and view was presented in that government. Socialists from Mapam sat alongside the revisionist Munekim begin and shared the glory and the power with the various factions that made up the Zionist labor movement. They were joined by members of the most secular liberal and the most religious and ultra-religious political parties. Never before, nor after, during this government's term in office, would such a consensual partnership lead the State of Israel in its future and crucial decisions. Contrary to common wisdom about the history of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, no one apart from the government of Israel played any crucial role, then and ever since, in deciding the fate of these territories or the people living in them. What these ministers decided in the second half of June 1967, and in the following months of July and August, has remained to this day the cornerstone of Israeli policy toward the occupied territories. None of the successive Israeli governments deviated from these past decisions, nor did they wish to deviate from them in any form or shape. The resolutions taken in that short period of 3 months, between June and August 1967, charted clearly the principles to which future governments in Israel would religiously adhere and from which they would not diverge, even during the most dramatic events that followed in years to come, be it the First or Second Intifada or the Oslo peace process and the Camp David Summit of 2000. One explanation for the resilience of this set of decisions is the Extraordinary composition of the 1967 government. As mentioned, this government represented, as never before and never since, the widest possible Zionist consensus. One can also attribute it to the euphoric mood in the wake of the total devastation of 6 Arab armies by the IDF and the successful blitzkrieg that ended with the military occupation of vast areas of Arab lands and countries. A messianic aura surrounded the decision-makers in those days, energizing them to take bold and historic decisions, which their successors would find hard to refute or change. All these plausible explanations tend to see the policies as the direct product of the particular and extraordinary circumstances of June 1967. But these decisions were mainly the inevitable outcome of Zionist ideology and history, however one chooses to define this ideology or insist on its shades and innuendos. The particular circumstances made it easier to remind the politicians of their ideological heritage, and reconnected them once more, as they did in 1948, to the Zionist drive to Judaize as much of historical Palestine as possible. The first decision was not to ethnically cleanse the population despite the joy of expanding the Jewish state onto what many Israelis felt were the natural and historical borders of ancient Israel. The ministers played with the idea but eventually ruled it out. They doubted whether the army had the will and mentality to carry it out, as it was unclear whether the army had sufficient means for accomplishing it. The second decision was to exclude the West Bank and the Gaza Strip from any future deal based on territories for peace, a principle that, at least in theory, the government accepted for the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. The prevailing sense in those meetings was that the international immunity for land expansion was guaranteed, not as an endorsement of expansionism per se, but more as an unwillingness to confront it. But with one crucial caveat: there could not be a de jure annexation of the territories, only a de facto one. The third one was not to grant full citizenship to the occupied population so as not to endanger the demographic Jewish majority. There was then, and there is now, a consensual Israeli impulse and overwhelming desire to keep the West Bank forever, while at the same time there was and is the twofold recognition of the undesirability of officially annexing these territories, and the inability to expel the population en masse. The aspirations about the Gaza Strip then and now are more ambivalent. The main drive was to see it disappear. It was a vision in 1967 which has become a dangerous blueprint for action these days. And yet keeping these territories, with the population in it, seemed as vital as the need to maintain a decisive Jewish majority in whatever constituted a Jewish state. The minutes of the meetings are now open to historians. They expose the impossibility and incompatibility of these two impulses: the appetite for possessing new land on the one hand and the reluctance to either drive out or fully incorporate the people living on them, on the other. But the documents also reveal a self-congratulatory satisfaction from the early discovery of a way out of the ostensible logical deadlock and theoretical impasse. The ministers were convinced, as all the ministers after them would be, that they had found the formula that would enable Israel to keep the territories it coveted, without annexing the people it negated, and while safeguarding its international immunity and reputation. When those three goals are translated into actual policies, they can only produce an inhuman and ruthless reality on the ground. There can be no benign or enlightened version for a policy meant to keep people in citizenless status for a long period of time. Only one known human invention operates in such a way which robs temporarily, or for longer period of times, the basic human and civil rights of citizens: the modern-day prison. The official Israeli navigation between impossible nationalist and colonialist ambitions turned 1.5 million people in 1967 into inmates of such a mega-prison. It was not a prison for a few inmates wrongly or rightly incarcerated, it was imposed on a society as a whole. It was and still is a system of malice that was built due to vile motives, but not only. Some of its architects searched genuinely for the most possible humane model for this prison, probably because they were aware that this was a collective punishment for a crime never committed. Others did not even bother to search for a softer version or more humane one. But the two camps existed, and therefore the government offered two versions of the mega-prison to the people in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. One was an open-air prison and the other a maximum security one. Should they not accept the former, they would get the latter. The open-air prison allowed a measure of autonomous life under indirect and direct Israeli control. The maximum security one robbed the Palestinians of all the autonomies and subjected them to a harsh policy of punishments, restriction, and in the worst-case scenario execution. The reality on the ground was that the open-air prison was harsh enough and sufficiently inhuman to trigger resistance from the enclaved population, and that the maximum security model was imposed as retaliation to Palestinian resistance. In general, the softer model was attempted twice between 1967 and 1987 and between 1993 and 2000, and the retaliations occurred in 1987. Until 1993 and 2000 until 2009. The open-air prison became the false paradigm of peace as it was marketed by Israel, and by American and European allies of the Jewish state, as an ingenious idea for how to solve the conflict. The best open prison was eventually propagated first as an autonomous zone, in the 1979 Camp David agreement between Israel and Egypt that led to nowhere, and later on as an independent Palestinian state in the Oslo Accord of 1993. When the Oslo Accord was translated into reality, by the sheer power of the occupier, the resemblance of the idea of a state to an open prison became clear with the partitioning of the West Bank into areas A, B, and C, and the exclusion of the Jewish settlements in Gaza from any Palestinian rule. The map of the Oslo B Accord of 1994 gave autonomy only in small parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but left the control of the enclave's security and sovereignty in the hands of the Israeli security apparatuses. When the Israeli regime felt security deteriorated for a short while, the maximum security model was reinstalled in 2002, and in many ways it is still there today, while the rebellious prison of Gaza is severely punished by a continuous siege and closure. The success of turning the open prison model into a diplomatic effort and a peace process could not have been possible had it not won the support of large sections of the Palestinian political elite, the Zionist left, and even some very well-known and highly respected international supporters of the Palestinian cause. But it is mainly a new creation, the Quartet, a kind of ad hoc international tribunal for Palestine, consisting of the European Union, Russia, the United States, and the United Nations, that gave the process the legitimacy it needed to be seen as a powerful paradigm for peace. In Israel and in the West, a huge laundry list of words and a very cooperative media and academia were essential for maintaining the moral and political validity of the open-air prison option, as the best solution for the conflict, and as an ideal vision for normal and healthy life in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Autonomy, self-determination, and finally independence were used, and mainly abused, as words to describe the best version of an open-air prison model the Israelis could offer the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But this laundry list did not cleanse the reality, and the hyperbolic discourse of peace and independence did not deafen the conscientious members of all the societies involved, in the territories, in Israel, and in the outside world. In the age of the Internet, an independent press, an active civil society, and energetic NGOs, it was hard to play the charade of peace and reconciliation on the ground where people were incarcerated in the biggest ever human prison witnessed in modern history. In this situation, out of conscious intention to control the area indefinitely and deny all the human rights of its people, Israel invented the magic formula of presenting the occupation as temporary. The status of the population will be settled with the coming of peace. This mode of operation allows Israel to continue to present itself as a democratic state, and enjoy the many benefits attached to this status in the international arena. Hence, the peace process and talk about two states for two peoples are not in any contradiction with the occupation, not even the temporary occupation of 1967. They are a political and conceptual framework designed to enable and perpetuate the status quo for as long as possible. Israel would find it hard to market this facade to the world if it were not assisted by many others, some serving their self-interests and others out of misled good intentions. The leadership of the Palestinian national movement also plays a key role in providing credibility for the fake peace process. It is followed by a large part of the leadership of the Palestinian Arab population within the Green Line. Many peace activists around the world have fallen into this trap. Meanwhile, Israel has been working on the ground to deepen its control over the land, water, economy, and all aspects of Palestinian lives. It creates a situation where even if a Palestinian state is announced, headed by Mahmoud Abbas as president, it will not have any practical significance. There is no chance of getting out of the deadlock in Palestine without tearing apart the facade of a fake peace process and the two-state solution. It is time to look for the key where we lost it. We need to start by correctly identifying the problem, expose Zionism as a colonialist movement and characterize Israel as an apartheid racist state. There is no other Zionism nor other Israel. Exposure, by itself, may have a huge effect, because of the importance of international support in preserving Israel's superiority against all local forces, but also due to internal conflicts within Israeli society. Any solution should be derived from our understanding of the problem. It should start with a discussion among all residents of the country on how to live together within a framework where all enjoy full rights, equality, and partnership. The Palestinian refugees should also take part in this discussion, as they have the right to return to Palestine and to fully take part in shaping their country's future. It is essential to set the goal of establishing one state for all inhabitants and refugees of the country, because it defines who should participate in the discussion about this future. Zionism has done, and continues to do, whatever it can to divide the Palestinian people and guide all of them to a dead end. First came the distancing of the refugees outside Palestine's borders and the isolation of the Palestinian population in the 1948 territories. Today we also witness the political separation between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, posing a new agenda, common to all sectors of the Palestinian people, is the beginning of the road toward a solution. Today's technology can provide the basis for an open discussion across borders and checkpoints, forming a platform for more intense links and together designing the common path. All this is not at all easy. There are problems in the relationship between different sectors of the public, between secular and religious folk, between the indigenous inhabitants and the third generation of settlers. A new distribution of resources is required to compensate for generations of dispossession and discrimination. It is not clear what will be the nature of the new society and what political framework we will build together, but it is essential that we start a serious discussion about all of it. Beyond that, we face a hard struggle against an oppressive regime that regards any perspective other than that of a racist Jewish state as suicide and an existential danger. This is our task, and those are the problems we must solve. Until we look straight at this reality, we are wasting precious time. Understanding the problem and presenting a real solution can create strong dynamics for changing the balance of power. Chapter 11. Ceasefires in which violations never cease. Noam Chomsky. On August 26, 2014, Israel and the Palestinian Authority, PA, both accepted a ceasefire agreement after a 50-day Israeli assault on Gaza that left 2,100 Palestinians dead and vast landscapes of destruction behind. The agreement calls for an end to military action by both Israel and Hamas, as well as an easing of the Israeli siege that has strangled Gaza for many years. This is, however, just the most recent of a series of ceasefire agreements reached after each of Israel's periodic escalations of its unremitting assault on Gaza. Throughout this period, the terms of these agreements remain essentially the same. The regular pattern is for Israel, then, to disregard whatever agreement is in place, while Hamas observes it, as Israel has officially recognized, until a sharp increase in Israeli violence elicits a Hamas response, followed by even fiercer brutality. Rather than mowing the lawn, in Israeli parlance, the most recent was more accurately described as removing the topsoil by a senior U.S. military officer. Appalled by the practices of the self-described, most moral army in the world. The first of this series was the Agreement on Movement and Access between Israel and the PA in November 2005. It called for a crossing between Gaza and Egypt at Rafah for the export of goods and the transit of people, continuous operation of crossings between Israel and Gaza for the import, export of goods, and the transit of people, reduction of obstacles to movement within the West Bank, bus and truck convoys between the West Bank and Gaza, the building of a seaport in Gaza, and the reopening of the airport in Gaza that Israeli bombing had demolished. That agreement was reached shortly after Israel withdrew its settlers and military forces from Gaza. The motive for the disengagement was explained by Dov Weissglass, a confidant of then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who was in charge of negotiating and implementing it. The significance of the disengagement plan is the freezing of the peace process, Weissglass informed the Israeli press. And when you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and you prevent a discussion on the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Effectively, this whole package called the Palestinian state, with all that it entails, has been removed indefinitely from our agenda. And all this with authority and permission. All with a U.S. presidential blessing and the ratification of both houses of Congress. True enough. The disengagement is actually formaldehyde, Weissglass added. It supplies the amount of formaldehyde that is necessary so there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. Israeli hawks also recognized that instead of investing substantial resources in maintaining a few thousand settlers in illegal communities in devastated Gaza, It made more sense to transfer them to illegal subsidized communities in areas of the West Bank that Israel intended to keep. The disengagement was depicted as a noble effort to pursue peace, but the reality was quite different. Israel never relinquished control of Gaza and is, accordingly, recognized as the occupying power by the United Nations, the United States, and other states, Israel apart, of course. In their comprehensive history of Israeli settlement in the occupied territories, Israeli scholars Edith Zertel and Akiva Eldar describe what actually happened when that country disengaged. The ruined territory was not released for even a single day from Israel's military grip or from the price of the occupation that the inhabitants pay every day. After the disengagement, Israel left behind scorched earth, devastated services, and people with neither a present nor a future. The settlements were destroyed in an ungenerous move by an unenlightened occupier, which in fact continues to control the territory and kill and harass its inhabitants by means of its formidable military might. Operations Cast Lead and Pillar of Defense. Israel soon had a pretext for violating the November agreement more severely. In January 2006, the Palestinians committed a serious crime. They voted the wrong way in carefully monitored free elections, placing the parliament in the hands of Hamas. Israel and the United States immediately imposed harsh sanctions, telling the world very clearly what they mean by democracy promotion. Europe, to its shame, went along as well. The United States and Israel soon began planning a military coup to overthrow the unacceptable elected government, a familiar procedure. When Hamas preempted the coup in 2007, the siege of Gaza became far more severe, along with regular Israeli military attacks. Voting the wrong way in a free election was bad enough, but preempting a U.S.-planned military coup proved to be an unpardonable offense. A new ceasefire agreement was reached in June 2008. It again called for opening the border crossings to allow the transfer of all goods that were banned and restricted to go into Gaza. Israel formally agreed to this, but immediately announced that it would not abide by the agreement and open the borders until Hamas released Gilad Shalit, an Israeli soldier held by Hamas. Israel itself has a long history of kidnapping civilians in Lebanon and on the high seas and holding them for lengthy periods, without credible charge, sometimes as hostages. Of course, imprisoning civilians on dubious charges, or none, is a regular practice in the territories Israel controls. But the standard Western distinction between people and unpeople, in Orwell's useful phrase, renders all this insignificant. Israel not only maintained the siege in violation of the June 2008 ceasefire agreement but did so with extreme rigor, even preventing the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which cares for the huge number of official refugees in Gaza, from replenishing its stocks. On November 4, while the media were focused on the U.S. presidential election, Israeli troops entered Gaza and killed half a dozen Hamas militants. That elicited a Hamas missile response and an exchange of fire. All the deaths were Palestinian. In late December, Hamas offered to renew the ceasefire. Israel considered the offer, but rejected it, preferring instead to launch Operation Cast Lead, a 3-week incursion of the full power of the Israeli military into the Gaza Strip, resulting in shocking atrocities well documented by international and Israeli human rights organizations. On January 8, 2009, while Cast Lead was in full fury, the UN Security Council passed a unanimous resolution, with the United States abstaining, calling for An immediate ceasefire leading to a full Israeli withdrawal, unimpeded provision through Gaza of food, fuel, and medical treatment, and intensified international arrangements to prevent arms and ammunition smuggling. A new ceasefire agreement was indeed reached, but the terms, similar to the previous ones, were again never observed and broke down completely with the next major mowing the lawn episode in November 2012. Operation Pillar of Defense. What happened in the interim can be illustrated by the casualty figures from January 2012 to the launching of that operation. 1 Israeli was killed by fire from Gaza while 78 Palestinians were killed by Israeli fire. The first act of Operation Pillar of Defense was the murder of Ahmed Jabari, a high official of the military wing of Hamas. Aluf Ben, editor-in-chief of Israel's leading newspaper Haaretz, described Jabari as Israel's subcontractor in Gaza, who enforced relative quiet there for more than 5 years. As always, there was a pretext for the assassination, but the likely reason was provided by Israeli peace activist Gershon Baskin. He had been involved in direct negotiations with Jabari for years and reported that, hours before he was assassinated, Jabari received the draft of a permanent truce agreement with Israel, which included mechanisms for maintaining the ceasefire in the case of a flare-up between Israel and the factions in the Gaza Strip. There is a long record of Israeli actions designed to deter the threat of a diplomatic settlement. After this exercise of mowing the lawn, a ceasefire agreement was reached yet again. Repeating the now standard terms, it called for a cessation of military action by both sides and the effective ending of the siege of Gaza with Israel, opening the crossings and facilitating the movements of people and transfer of goods, and refraining from restricting residents' free movements and targeting residents in border areas. What happened next was reviewed by Nathan Thrall, senior Middle East analyst of the International Crisis Group. Israeli intelligence recognized that Hamas was observing the terms of the ceasefire. Israel, Thrall wrote, therefore saw little incentive in upholding its end of the deal. In the 3 months following the ceasefire, its forces made regular incursions into Gaza, strafed Palestinian farmers and those collecting scrap and rubble across the border, and fired at boats, preventing fishermen from accessing the majority of Gaza's waters. In other words, the siege never ended. Crossings were repeatedly shut. So-called buffer zones inside Gaza, from which Palestinians are barred, and which include a third or more of the Strip's limited arable land, were reinstated. Imports declined, exports were blocked, and fewer Gazans were given exit permits to Israel and the West Bank. Operation Protective Edge. So matters continued until April 2014, when an important event took place. The 2 major Palestinian groupings, Gaza-based Hamas and the Fatah-dominated PA in the West Bank, signed a unity agreement. Hamas made major concessions. The unity government contained none of its members or allies. In substantial measure, as Nathan Thrall observes, Hamas turned over governance of Gaza to the PA. Several thousand PA security forces were sent there, and the PA placed its guards at borders and crossings, with no reciprocal positions for Hamas in the West Bank security apparatus. Finally, the unity government accepted the 3 conditions that Washington and the European Union had long demanded: nonviolence, adherence to past agreements, and the recognition of Israel. Israel was infuriated. Its government declared at once that it would refuse to deal with the unity government and cancelled negotiations. Its fury mounted when the United States, along with most of the world, signaled Support for the unity government. There are good reasons why Israel opposes the unification of Palestinians. One is that the Hamas-Fatah conflict has provided a useful pretext for refusing to engage in serious negotiations. How can one negotiate with a divided entity? More significantly, for more than 20 years, Israel has been committed to separating Gaza from the West Bank in violation of the Oslo Accords it signed in 1993, which declare Gaza and the West Bank to be an inseparable territorial unity. A look at a map explains the rationale. Separated from Gaza, any West Bank enclaves left to Palestinians have no access to the outside world. They are contained by two hostile powers, Israel and Jordan, both close U.S. allies. And contrary to illusions, the United States is very far from a neutral, honest broker. Furthermore, Israel has been systematically taking over the Jordan Valley, driving out Palestinians, establishing settlements, sinking wells, and otherwise ensuring that the region, about one-third of the West Bank, with much of its arable land, will ultimately be integrated into Israel along with the other regions that country is taking over. Hence remaining Palestinian cantons will be completely imprisoned. Unification with Gaza would interfere with these plans, which trace back to the early days of the occupation and have had steady support from the major political blocs, including figures usually portrayed as doves like former President Shimon Peres, who was one of the architects of settlement deep in the West Bank. As usual, a pretext was needed to move on to the next escalation, which arose when 3 Israeli boys from the settler community in the West Bank were brutally murdered. The Israeli police have since been searching for and arresting members of a dissident group in Hebron, still claiming, without evidence, that they are Hamas terrorists. On September 2nd, Haaretz reported that, after very intensive interrogations, the Israeli security services concluded the abduction of the teenagers was carried out by an independent cell, with no known direct links to Hamas. But the 18-day rampage by the Israeli Defense Forces succeeded in undermining the feared unity government and provoking Hamas to respond by firing its first rockets in 18 months, providing Israel with the pretext to launch Operation Protective Edge on July 8. The 50-day assault proved the most extreme exercise in mowing the lawn, so far. Operation, still to be named. Israel is in a fine position today to reverse its decades-old policy of separating Gaza from the West Bank in violation of its solemn agreements and to observe a major ceasefire agreement, for the first time. At least temporarily, the threat of democracy in neighboring Egypt has been diminished, and the brutal Egyptian military dictatorship of General Abdul Fattah al-Sisi is a welcome ally for Israel in maintaining control over Gaza. The Palestinian Unity Government, as noted earlier, is placing the U.S. trained forces of the Palestinian Authority in control of Gaza's borders, and governance may be shifting into the hands of the PA, which depends on Israel for its survival, as well as for its finances. Israel might feel that its takeover of Palestinian territory in the West Bank has proceeded so far, that there is little to fear from some limited form of autonomy for Palestinians in the enclaves that remain. There is also some truth to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's observation. Many elements in the region understand today that, in the struggle in which they are threatened, Israel is not an enemy but a partner. Akiva Eldar, Israel's leading diplomatic correspondent, adds, however, that all those many elements in the region also understand that there is no brave and comprehensive diplomatic move on the horizon without an agreement on the establishment of a Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders and a just agreed-upon solution to the refugee problem. That is not on Israel's agenda, he points out, and is in fact in direct conflict with the 1999 electoral program of the governing Likud coalition, never rescinded, which flatly rejects the establishment of a Palestinian Arab state west of the Jordan River. Some knowledgeable Israeli commentators, notably columnist Danny Rubenstein, believe that Israel is poised to reverse course and relax its stranglehold on Gaza. We'll see. The record of these past years suggests otherwise, and the first signs are not auspicious. As Operation Protective Edge ended, Israel announced its largest appropriation of West Bank land in 30 years, almost 1,000 acres. Israel Radio reported that the takeover was in response to the killing of the 3 Jewish teenagers by Hamas militants. A Palestinian boy was burned to death in retaliation for the murder, but no Israeli land was handed to Palestinians, nor was there any reaction when an Israeli soldier murdered 10-year-old Khalil Anadi on a quiet street in a refugee camp near Hebron, on August 10, while the most moral army in the world was smashing Gaza to bits, and then drove away in his jeep as the child bled to death. Anadi was one of the 23 Palestinians, including 3 children, killed by Israeli occupation forces in the West Bank during the Gaza onslaught, according to UN statistics, along with more than 2,000 wounded, 38% by live fire. None of those killed were endangering soldiers' lives, Israeli journalist Gideon Levy reported. To none of this is there any reaction, just as there was no reaction while Israel killed, on average, more than 2 Palestinian children a week for the past 14 years. They are unpeople, after all. It is commonly claimed on all sides that, if the 2-state settlement is dead as a result of Israel's takeover of Palestinian lands, then the outcome will be 1 state west of the Jordan. Some Palestinians welcome this outcome, anticipating that they can then conduct a civil rights struggle for equal rights on the model of South Africa under apartheid. Many Israeli commentators warn that the resulting demographic problem of more Arab than Jewish births and diminishing Jewish immigration will undermine their hope for a democratic Jewish state. But these widespread beliefs are dubious. The realistic alternative to a 2-state settlement is that Israel will continue to carry forward the plans it has been implementing for years, taking over whatever is of value to it in the West Bank, while avoiding Palestinian population concentrations and removing Palestinians from the areas it is integrating into Israel. That should avoid the dreaded demographic problem. The areas being integrated into Israel include a vastly expanded Greater Jerusalem, the area within the illegal separation wall, and corridors cutting through the regions to the east, and will probably also encompass the Jordan Valley. Gaza will likely remain under its usual harsh siege, separated from the West Bank. And the Syrian Golan Heights, like Jerusalem, annexed in violation of Security Council orders, will quietly become part of Greater Israel. In the meantime, West Bank Palestinians will be contained in unviable cantons, with special accommodation for elites in standard neocolonial style. These basic policies have been underway since the 1967 conquest, following a principle enunciated by then Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, one of the Israeli leaders most sympathetic to the Palestinians. He informed his party colleagues that they should tell Palestinian refugees in the West Bank, "We have no solution, you shall continue to live like dogs, and whoever wishes may leave, and we will see where this process leads." The suggestion was natural within the overriding conception articulated in 1972, By future President Chaim Herzog, I do not deny the Palestinians a place or stand or opinion on every matter, but certainly I am not prepared to consider them as partners in any respect in a land that has been consecrated in the hands of our nation for thousands of years. For the Jews of this land there cannot be any partner. Dayan also called for Israel's permanent rule, Memshalit Kiva, over the occupied territories. When Netanyahu expresses the same stand today, he is not breaking new ground. Like other states, Israel pleads insecurity as justification for its aggressive and violent actions. But knowledgeable Israelis know better. Their recognition of reality was articulated clearly in 1972 by Air Force Commander, and later President, Ezer Weizman. He explained that there would be no security problem if Israel were to accept the international call to withdraw from the territories it conquered in 1967, but the country would not then be able to exist according to the scale, spirit, and quality she now embodies. For a century, the Zionist colonization of Palestine has proceeded primarily on the pragmatic principle of the quiet establishment of facts on the ground, which the world was to ultimately come to accept. It has been a highly successful policy. There is every reason to expect it to persist as long as the United States provides the necessary military, economic, diplomatic, and ideological support. For those concerned with the rights of the brutalized Palestinians, there can be no higher priority than working to change U.S. policies, not an idle dream by any means. Adapted from Ceasefires in Which Violations Never Cease. Tom Dispatch, September 9, 2014. Chapter 12. An Address to the United Nations. Noam Chomsky. It's a pleasure to be here to be able to talk with you and discuss with you afterwards. Many of the world's problems are so intractable that it's hard to think of ways even to take steps toward mitigating them. The Israel-Palestine conflict is not one of these. On the contrary, the general outlines of a diplomatic solution have been clear for at least 40 years. Not the end of the road, nothing ever is, but a significant step forward. And the obstacles to a resolution are also quite clear. The basic outlines were presented here in a resolution brought to the UN Security Council in January 1976. It called for a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border, and now I'm quoting, with guarantees for the rights of both states to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. The resolution was brought by the three major Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, sometimes called the confrontation states. Israel refused to attend the session. The resolution was vetoed by the United States. A U.S. veto typically is a double veto. The resolution, is not implemented, and the event is vetoed from history, so you have to look hard to find the record, but it is there. That has set the pattern that has continued since. The most recent U.S. veto was in February 2011, that's President Obama, when his administration vetoed a resolution calling for implementation of official U.S. policy opposition to expansion of settlements. And it's worth bearing in mind that expansion of settlements is not really the issue, it's the settlements, unquestionably illegal, along with the infrastructure projects supporting them. For a long time, there has been an overwhelming international consensus in support of a settlement along these general lines. The pattern that was set in January 1976 continues to the present. Israel rejects a settlement of these terms and for many years has been devoting extensive resources to ensuring that it will not be implemented, with the unremitting and decisive support of the United States. Military, economic, diplomatic, and indeed ideological, by establishing how the conflict is viewed and interpreted in the United States and within its broad sphere of influence. There's no time here to review the record, but its general character is revealed by a look at what has happened in Gaza in the past decade, carrying forward a long history of earlier crimes. Last August, August 26th, a ceasefire was reached between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And the question on all our minds is, what are the prospects for the future? Well, one reasonable way to try to answer that question is to look at the record. And here, too, there is a definite pattern. A ceasefire is reached, Israel disregards it and continues its steady assault on Gaza, including continued siege, intermittent acts of violence, more settlement and development projects, often violence in the West Bank. Hamas observes the ceasefire, as Israel officially recognizes, until some Israeli escalation elicits a Hamas response, which leads to another exercise of mowing the lawn, in Israeli parlance, each episode more fierce and destructive than the last. The first of the series was the Agreement on Movement and Access in November 2005. I'll give a close paraphrase of it. It called for a crossing between Gaza and Egypt at Rafah for the export of goods and the transit of people, continuous operation of crossings between Israel and Gaza for the import and export of goods and the transit of people, reduction of obstacles to movement within the West Bank, bus and truck convoys between the West Bank and Gaza, the building of a seaport in Gaza, the reopening of the airport in Gaza that Israel had recently destroyed. These are essentially the terms of successive ceasefires, including the one just reached a few weeks ago. The timing of the November 2005 agreement is significant. This was the moment of Israel's disengagement, as it's called, from Gaza, the removal of several thousand Israeli settlers from Gaza. Now, this is depicted as a noble effort to seek peace and development, but the reality is rather different. The reality was described, very quickly, by the Israeli official who was in charge of negotiating and implementing the ceasefire, Dov Weissglass, close confidant of then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. As he explained to the Israeli press, the goal of the disengagement, I'm quoting him, was the freezing of the peace process, so as to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and to ensure that diplomacy has been removed indefinitely from our agenda. The reality on the ground is described by Israel's leading specialists on the occupation, a respected historian, Edith Zertel, and Israel's leading diplomatic correspondent, Akiva Eldar, wrote the major book, the standard work on the settlement project, called Lords of the Land, referring to the settlers. What they say about the disengagement is this: they say, the ruined territory, and by then, it was ruined, largely part of the reason for the removal of the settlers. The ruined territory was not released for even a single day from Israel's military grip, or from the price of the occupation that the inhabitants pay every day. After the disengagement, Israel left behind scorched earth, devastated services, and people with neither a present nor a future. The settlements were destroyed in an ungenerous move by an unenlightened occupier, which in fact continues to control the territory and to kill and harass its inhabitants by means of its formidable military might. Now, that's an accurate description from the most respected Israeli source. The Oslo Accords, 20 years ago, established that Gaza and the West Bank are an indivisible territorial unity, whose integrity cannot be broken up. For 20 years, the United States and Israel have been dedicated to separate Gaza and the West Bank in violation of the accords that they had accepted. And a look at the map explains why. Gaza offers the only access to the outside world of Palestine. If Gaza is separated from the West Bank, whatever autonomy might ultimately be granted in the West Bank would be imprisoned, Israel on one side, a hostile Jordan, ally of Israel, on the other side, and in addition, one of Israel's slow and steady US-backed policies is to take over the Jordan Valley, about a third of the West Bank, much of the arable land, which would essentially imprison the rest even more tightly, if Gaza is separated from the West Bank. Now, that's the major geostrategic reason for the Israeli insistence, with US backing, on separating the two in violation of the Oslo agreements and the series of ceasefires that have been reached since November 2005. Well, the November 2005 agreement lasted for a few weeks. In January 2006, a very important event took place, the first full, free election in the Arab world, carefully monitored, recognized to be free and fair. It had one flaw: it came out the wrong way. Hamas won the parliament, control of the parliament. The US and Israel didn't want that. You may recall, at that period, the slogan on everyone's lips was democracy promotion. The highest US commitment in the world was democracy promotion. Here was a good test. Democracy, election came out the wrong way. The US instantly decided, along with Israel, to punish the Palestinians for the crime of voting the wrong way. A harsh siege was instituted, other punishments, violence increased. The United States immediately began to organize a military coup to overthrow the unacceptable government. That's quite familiar practice. I won't go through the record. The European Union, to its shame and discredit, went along with this. There was an immediate Israeli escalation. That was the end of the November agreement, followed by major Israeli onslaughts. In 2007, a year later, Hamas committed even a greater crime than winning a fair election. It preempted the planned military coup and took over Gaza. That's described in the West, in the United States, most of the West, as Hamas's taking over Gaza by force, which is not false, but something is omitted. The force was preempting a planned military coup to overthrow the elected government. Now, that was a serious crime. It's bad enough to vote the wrong way in a free election, but to preempt a US planned military coup is far more serious. The attack on Gaza increased substantially at that point, major Israeli onslaughts. Finally, in January 2008, another ceasefire was reached. Terms were pretty much the same as those that I quoted. Israel publicly rejected the ceasefire, said that it would not abide by it. Hamas observed the ceasefire, as Israel officially recognizes, despite Israel's refusal to do so. Now, that continued until November 4, 2008. On November 4, which was the day of the US election, Israeli forces invaded Gaza, killed half a dozen Hamas militants. That led to Qassam rockets attacking Israel, then a huge Israeli response, lots of killings, all Palestinians, as usual. By the end of December, a couple of weeks later, Hamas offered to renew the ceasefire. The Israeli cabinet considered it and rejected it. This was a dovish cabinet, led by Ehud Olmert, rejected it and decided to launch the next major military operation. That was Cast Lead, which was a horrible operation, so much so that it caused a very substantial international reaction. Investigations by a United Nations Commission, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. In the middle of the assault, incidentally, was carefully timed to end immediately before President Obama's inauguration. He had already been elected, but he wasn't inaugurated yet, so when he was asked to comment on the ongoing atrocities, he responded by saying that he couldn't do so. The United States has only one president, and he wasn't president yet. He was talking about lots of other things, but not this. The attack was timed to end immediately before the inauguration, so he therefore could respond to the questions by saying, well, now is not the time to look at the past, let's look forward to the future. Diplomats know very well that that's a standard slogan for those who are engaged in serious crime. Let's forget about the past. Let's look forward to a glorious future. Well, that was right in the middle of the assault. The Security Council did pass a resolution, unanimously, the U.S. abstaining, calling for an immediate ceasefire with the usual terms. That was January 8, 2009. It was never observed, and it broke down completely with the next major episode of mowing the lawn in November 2012. Now, you can get a good sense of what was going on by looking at the casualty figures for the year 2012. 79 people were killed, 78 of them Palestinians, the usual story as leading Middle East analyst Nathan Thrall writes. Israel recognized that Hamas was observing the terms of the ceasefire, and therefore saw little incentive in doing the same. The military attacks on Gaza increased, along with more stringent restrictions on imports. Exports were blocked. Exit permits were blocked. That continued until April 2014, when Palestinians committed another crime. Gaza-based Hamas and West Bank-based Palestinian Authority signed a unity agreement. Israel was infuriated even more when the world mostly supported it. Even the United States gave weak, but actual, support. Several reasons for the Israeli reaction. One is that unity between Gaza and the West Bank, between the two movements, would threaten the long-standing policies of separating the two, for the reasons that I mentioned. Another reason was that a unity government undermines one of the pretexts for Israel's refusal to participate in negotiations seriously. Namely, how can we negotiate with an entity that is internally divided? Well, if they're unified, that pretext disappears. Israel was infuriated. It launched major assaults on the Palestinians in the West Bank, primarily targeting Hamas. Hundreds of people arrested, mostly Hamas members. Also Gaza, also killings. There was a pretext, of course. There always is. The pretext was that 3 teenagers, Israeli teenagers, in the settlements had been brutally murdered, captured and murdered. Israel claimed officially that they thought that they were alive, so therefore launched a long, several weeks assault on the West Bank, alleging that they were trying to find them alive. Meanwhile, the arrests, attacks, and so on. It turns out that they knew immediately that they had been killed. Now, they also knew immediately that it was very unlikely that Hamas was involved. The government said they had certain knowledge that Hamas had done it, but their own leading specialists, like Shlomi Eldar, had pointed out right away that the assault, which was a brutal crime, was very likely committed by members of a breakaway clan, the Kawazma clan in Hebron, which was not given a green light by Hamas and had been a thorn in its side. And that, apparently, is true, if you look at the later arrests and punishments. Anyway, that was a pretext for this assault, killings in Gaza, too. That finally elicited a Hamas response. Then came Operation Protective Edge, the one which was just completed, and more brutal and destructive even than the ones that preceded it. The pattern is very clear. And so far, at least, it appears to be continuing. The latest ceasefire was reached on August 26. It was followed at once by Israel's greatest land grab in 30 years, almost 1,000 acres in the Gush Etzion area near what's called Jerusalem. Greater Jerusalem, about 5 times the size of anything that Jerusalem ever was, taken over by Israel, annexed in violation of Security Council orders. The U.S. State Department informed the Israeli embassy that, I'm quoting it now, Israeli activity in Gush Etzion undermines American efforts to protect Israel at the United Nations, and urged that Israel shouldn't provide ammunition for those at the United Nations who would interpret Israel's position as hardening. Actually, that warning was given 47 years ago, in September 1967, at the time of Israel's first colonization, illegal colonization, of Gush Etzion. Israeli historian Gershom Gurenberg recently reminded us of this. Little has changed since, in the last 47 years, apart from the scale of the crimes, which continue, without a break, with constant U.S. support. Well, as for the prospects, there is a conventional picture. It's repeated constantly on all sides: Israel, Palestine, independent commentators, diplomats. The picture that's presented is that there are 2 alternatives: either the 2-state settlement, which represents an overwhelming international consensus, virtually everyone, and if that fails, there will have to be one state. Israel will take over the West Bank, the Palestinians will hand over the keys, as it's sometimes said. Palestinians often have favored that. They say then they will be able to carry out a civil rights struggle, maybe modeled on the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, fight for civil rights within the whole one state controlled by Israel. Now, Israelis criticize that on the grounds of what is called the demographic problem, the fact that there will be too many non-Jews in a Jewish state, in fact, pretty soon a majority. Those are the alternatives that are presented, overwhelmingly, hardly an exception. My own opinion, which I've written about repeatedly, without convincing many people, apparently, but I'll try to convince you, is that this is a total illusion. Those are not the 2 alternatives. There are 2 alternatives, but they're different ones. One alternative is the international consensus on a 2-state settlement, basically the terms of January 1976. By now, it's virtually everyone: the Arab League, the Organization of Islamic States, which includes Iran, Europe, Latin America, informally, at least, just about everyone. That's one option. The other option, the realistic one, is that Israel will continue doing exactly what it is doing right now, before our eyes, visible, with U.S. support, which is also visible. And what's happening is not a secret. You can open the newspapers and read it. Israel is taking over what they call Jerusalem, as I mentioned, a huge area. Maybe 5 times the area of historic Jerusalem, Greater Jerusalem, big area in the West Bank, includes many Arab villages being dispossessed, destroyed, bringing settlers in. All of this is doubly illegal. All the settlements are illegal, as determined by the Security Council, advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. But the Jerusalem settlements are doubly illegal, because they're also in violation of explicit Security Council orders going back to 1968, with the U.S. actually voting for them at that time, barring any change in the status of Jerusalem. But it continues. That's Greater Jerusalem. There are then corridors extending to the east. One major corridor, extending from Jerusalem almost to Jericho, virtually bisecting the West Bank, includes the Israeli town of Ma'ale Adumim, which was built largely during the Clinton administration, with the obvious purpose of bisecting the West Bank, still a little contested territory, but that's the goal. There's another corridor further to the north including the town of Ariel, partially bisecting what remains. And another one further to the north including the town of Kadumim. If you look at the map, these essentially break up the West Bank into pretty much cantons. It looks, from a map, as though a large territory is left, but that's misleading. Most of that is uninhabitable desert. And that's separate from what I mentioned before, the slow, steady takeover of the Jordan Valley to the east, again, about a third of the arable land, the country. Israel has no official policy of taking it over, but they're pursuing the policy in the way that has been carried out now for 100 years, literally. Small steps so nobody notices, or at least people pretend not to notice, establish a military zone. The Palestinians who live there have to be displaced because it's a military zone, no settlement allowed. And pretty soon there's a military settlement, Nahal settlement, and another, then. Sooner or later, it becomes an actual settlement. Meanwhile, dig wells, dispossess the population, set up green zones, a large variety of techniques which have, by now, reduced the Arab population from about 300,000 in 1967 to roughly 60,000 today. As I mentioned, that essentially imprisons what's left. I don't think Israel has any intention of taking over the Palestinian population concentrations, which are left out of these plans. There are analogies often made to South Africa, but they're quite misleading. South Africa relied on its black population. That was 85% of the population. It was its workforce. And they had to sustain them, just like slave owners have to maintain their capital. They tried to sustain the population. They even tried to gain international support for the Bantustans. Israel has no such attitude toward the Palestinians. They don't want to have anything to do with them. If they leave, that's fine. If they die, that's fine. In standard neo-colonial pattern, Israel is permitting the establishment of a center for Palestinian elites in Ramallah, where you have nice restaurants and theaters and so on. Every third world country under the colonial system had something like that. Now, that's the picture that's emerging. It's taking shape before our eyes. It has so far worked very well. If it continues, Israel will not face a demographic problem. When these regions are integrated slowly into Israel, actually, the proportion of Jews in Greater Israel will increase. There are very few Palestinians there. Those who are there are being dispossessed, kicked out. That's what's taking shape before our eyes. I think that's the realistic alternative to a two-state settlement. And there's every reason to expect it to continue as long as the United States supports it. This essay is based on a speech delivered to the United Nations General Assembly on October 14, 2014.